Few thoughts today. Sermon title, Waiting for the Knock on the Door. This passage made me think of that with the doors locked, people hiding inside. That phrase also stuck with me from reading about life in totalitarian societies. Especially in the Cold War era, it was we could still find a lot of works about what it was like living, for instance, in the Soviet Union, where everybody was scared of that knock on the door. That knock that would mean a drastic change in your life. An intervention that you didn't want, that would either mean that you would be taken away for questioning, or that you would be locked up, or that you would disappear. And everybody lived in fear inside, behind locked doors, waiting for that knock on the door. It also made me think about my work as a chaplain in the military, in a specific unit in the old Cold War days. We were two chaplains in that unit, and we would always work it that way, that one would be deployed with the soldiers in the operations they had to conduct, which was always high risk, and one would stay behind, so that when the death messages, which there was always, whatever the mission was, it was just how many times you had to convey that somebody had been killed, so that one was behind at the home base to convey those news messages to the families. And I remember quite often, I would always do it very early in the morning. Most soldiers reside on base, and I would go very early before anybody was awake, because people would know when they would see my vehicle arriving that somebody would have been killed, and then there was upheaval before I could reach the family. So I arrived with a son normally at the house, and I always thought that knock on the door was like death knocking on the door. It felt terrible to be the angel of death. And I think people were living in fear of me, because I was the bringer of the death message quite often, for many years. And we find the disciples here hiding as well, probably also being afraid of the knock on the door, because this was shortly after that Passover festival when Jesus was killed, when he was crucified. A public demonstration, state terrorism. That was what the empire did with somebody that was causing unrest, that was making trouble. They would take the leader and crucify him or her, but mostly him, as a demonstration and say, watch out. If you mess with the empire, this is where you will end up, on the cross. And it was done in very public places. And the same was done with Jesus. So one can understand being of the inner circle around this person that was just crucified and declared an enemy of the state and removed, like the empire did with enemies of the empire, that you would not consider venturing out into that city to be seen, because you were known to be associated with this figure that was just killed by the state. Not quietly disappearing like in the Cold War days in totalitarian societies, but publicly executed. So one can imagine these disciples hiding, being afraid that the same fate may befall them, or perhaps also wondering, what now? What are we supposed to do now? Jesus spoke good stuff and nice stuff about the kingdom. about God's world arriving, creating hope for many in many different ways, but expecting something good to happen. And even perhaps when he was, making a ruckus in the temple, overturning the tables around a very volatile time, the Passover festival in Jerusalem, when the Romans were there in bigger numbers, the soldiers, expecting trouble from the Jews. At such a time, perhaps when Jesus was doing all that, we're thinking, but, somehow this will be okay. It will not end up in the mess that it was with Jesus being killed. And John describes this, and he uses the phrase, they were afraid of the Jews. In some translations, it is translated as the Jewish authorities. And I think it's worthwhile just taking a little digression to address that they were afraid of the Jews, because these words that the Jews killed Jesus led to terrible things being done in the name of Christianity right through the ages. John writes this gospel quite a number of decades after the events that he's describing. And this was the time after the destruction of the temple when the Jews revolted against the empire and actually succeeded in driving them from Jerusalem for 4 years. While the empire was dealing with its own internal squabbles and civil war in the empire, the Jews had a reprieve, and they were able to throw the Romans out of Jerusalem and reclaim the temple again. But after the 4 years, when the Romans have settled their affairs, they returned with vengeance and did what the empire do to people who rebel against them. They flattened Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and the wall and everything in that city. So the Jews were state enemy number 1 then. And for the time following that, the Jesus followers, who was an internal Jewish group that said Jesus was a proper rabbi and had to be followed, and that he was the Messiah, in that internal squabble of the Jews, John wrote this letter, trying to put distance between the Christians or the Jesus followers and state enemy number 1, the rest of the Jewish group. So he wrote these words saying, the Jews, meaning the other Jews, not us, an internal reference to the divisions existing in the broader Jewish community. And I think it's worthwhile remembering that this is written from inside Judaism, from the Jewish community in Jerusalem and worldwide, saying, those other people, not the followers of Jesus, you other Jews, we're afraid of you, trying to put distance, as I say, between themselves and the rest of the Jewish community. Here they were, huddling together, intimidated by fear, paralyzed, afraid to go out, wondering what next, what should we do? Living as post-Easter people, but not realizing what it meant. John has 4 accounts of Jesus appearing to individuals and to people, groups of people. And each account seems not to really be related to the other. It doesn't seem that there's a golden thread that you can see. This is how John weaves it between the different appearances of Jesus. Each one has its own specific character and seems to have its own central theme, the main thing that this appearance of Jesus after the crucifixion and after the grave was found empty, that it wants to convey. This is the second one. after Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. And he tells her, go and tell the others. And she says, all right. She conveyed that to them. But they don't seem to know anything about it if you read the two passages. It is as if Mary didn't speak to them. But while they were huddled there in this narrative, this account of Jesus appearing, there was no knock on the door. Jesus was just there. So instead of wondering how this is possible, and like so many fights through the ages and squabbles among scholars, was it the physical resurrection and how could he walk through the walls, or was it the spiritual one? That's not the point. Jesus was with them. And the point of this appearance of Jesus, the main theme was this. And if you read through the passage, you can see that. Jesus was commissioning them, saying to them, listen, what I did, you can do. And the kingdom that I spoke about, that is in you, and you can effect that kingdom as well. I speak to you of God's peace. God's peace is with you, and you can bring God's peace to the world. And the last verse illustrates that well. God was the only one in the Jewish mind that could give forgiveness of sins. God was the only one. And what did Jesus say to his disciples here when he was commissioning them? He said, you disciples gathered here in fear, wondering what to do. I tell you, you are empowered to forgive people their sins. If you forgive people, they are forgiven. And if you don't do it, those sins are still there. The unforgiveness remains. You have the power to change the world. That is what Jesus told his disciples. That is the point that John tries to convey with this message. And Jesus tells them, get up and stand up for what is right. Get out and speak out for what is right. Stand up and stand to be counted for what is just, what brings peace, what is the world of the kingdom. Don't be intimidated, don't be paralyzed by fear. I commission you, and you are empowered to do the work that I started, and the work that still needs to be done and that can be done because of Easter. And those words could have just as well been spoken to us today by Jesus, the risen Christ. For us in the post-Easter weeks, Bart and I had a conversation about Easter music. You know, we have Easter Sunday, and then we play those beautiful Easter music, and we sing the hymns, and then we're done with it. The one Sunday in the year. It's like Christmas carols. We're not supposed to sing it during Advent. Then it's Christmas, and then the Sunday after Christmas, I think it's also allowed in the Orthodox view on church music. So that's why we're singing Easter hymns today as well. Easter is not gone. Easter is still with us. The beautiful flowers of Easter, apart from the music, the Easter egg hunt, the pancake breakfast, and all the celebration of Easter. Are we done with that now? Returning to normalcy and the slogging of every day. Perhaps reverting to being intimidated people, fearful people, afraid of many things, with fear being preached So often, fear being thrown into our faces from the screens that we're attached to. So often. Fear being part of our lives, dictating our existence, like we are living behind doors that will receive a knock on it, as if we're living in a totalitarian society where we need to be afraid, who's coming to knock on the door? Will that knock bring that incision, that change in my life, that intervention that will mean disaster? How are we gathered? And how do we live as post-Easter Christians? Are we letting fear of whatever and whoever confine us to live in a way where we don't live fully? Perhaps it is time for, in the first place, the church worldwide, to hear the Easter message. In this time, especially in the Western world, where the church is going one way, in influence, in membership, in every yardstick that you can apply, where we've become a domesticated church, afraid of so many things. Perhaps we need to hear, you are empowered to do the work of the kingdom. That is what the risen Christ commissioned you to do, to stand up, to get out, to do the work. Perhaps that is what Congregational Church in Topsfield need to hear and affirm and embrace again. We are commissioned, we are empowered to do the work of the risen Christ, and not to live in fear. To hear that the kingdom is in us, and that we can create the kingdom around us. And perhaps we need to hear it as individuals and as families as well, that we as individuals are so often scared of especially broken relationships, that we've accepted the abnormal and what is wrong as being normal, that we are afraid to go out and speak up and speak out and say, my friend, or my husband, or my wife, or my child, my family member, my community member, this thing that is between us, this thing that is intimidating me to exist in a situation of fear, because I'm afraid to address it. I'm afraid of what may happen if I speak up. The only thing that can happen is that the current negative situation can persist, or it can get better. It can be repaired. So let us as individuals also hear the Easter message of Jesus. You have the power to forgive. You also have the power to withhold forgiveness. You are my messengers in the world. Assume that responsibility. Go and do what is right, and do not live in fear. Do not be afraid of the knock on the door that may change your life to the negative. Open the door and get out and speak out and stand up and stand for what is right. And go out in the first place. Be God's forgiving people. Grant that forgiveness. Be God's people that work for reconciliation. Go and be God's people that bring peace and justice. Maybe we hear that message and start today opening the doors and leave this meeting house in the Spirit of Christ, the risen Christ that calls us today to be His people in the world. Amen.